Hi, guys. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. We have an exciting one for you today. If you know that you're not telling the story of your solution as well as you'd like, and a lot of companies know that, then you must also know that you're missing out on deals.
This episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast is brought to you by our sales coaching and consulting services. Are you looking to create repeatable, scalable, and predictable revenue? We've helped thousands of companies grow their business with tailored expert advice backed by testing to ensure they establish the best practices that'll work for them. Head over to bit.ly/predictable revenue coaching to learn more.
Unilever, Barclays, and the corporate executive board, and now a decade into building Oratium, he has developed remarkable insights into the science of designing and delivering extraordinary sales messaging. Tim Pollard, welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to dive in. Just for a little bit of context here, what kind of messaging are we talking about, Tim? Are we talking cold messaging? Are we talking demos?
So the principles of messaging apply across the full spectrum. Anything from maybe a very short message you might put out there through non-sales channels to maybe secure early conversations. Then I think what we really focus on is actual sales conversational message design, anything from an early stage conversation right through to the final deal closing conversation, anything from the altitude of the buying group right up to the C-suite. So what we're really about is how do you design a very crisp, powerful, compelling sales conversation that, as you said, will win more deals and in shorter cycle times.
So how are a lot of salespeople getting this wrong today, and what are the impacts of that?
So it's a great question. I mean, you could talk all day just about that one question. When you see the way most companies do messaging, you see these bloated PowerPoint decks, and PowerPoint is not the fundamental problem, although you never want to use PowerPoint when you're selling. I'll talk about why in a second. What you typically see, though, is if PowerPoint is a vehicle, then embedded within this vehicle are the three really toxic mistakes people make. The first one is TMI. It's just insane how much material we pack or try and pack into our communications, even though we have a lifetime of experience as a receiver. If you're on the receiving end of that, you never like it, you hate it, you switch off, you disconnect, and yet we still do it to other people, which tells us a little bit about how deeply ingrained some of these habits are. The second issue with most messaging is that it is just too confusing. And what I mean by that is companies' value propositions are just unclear. This is a deck from it doesn't matter who it is, but it's a well-known, very well-known technology company. You all know them by name. And I could go through slide by slide. I sort of get some of the words, not all of them, but I just don't understand why would this be a useful thing, a valuable thing for me to pursue. And then the third hallmark of getting it wrong, and these are all toxic, but particularly toxic, is almost all messaging is just thoroughly sender-oriented. We just go in and talk about ourselves. At the extreme, this is a deck from a company in the electrical industry. You know, it starts with a picture of their building. Well, that's kind of a standing joke for us, but then there's another picture of another building, and then more buildings in the US, and then buildings, yay, Sarah, buildings in Canada and Brazil and China. I mean, we're 12 slides in with no hint of anything that could be of any relevance to the customer. So typically these three things show up together. Often it's wrapped up in some sort of very toxic PowerPoint deck. But when we do it this way, the second part of your question was very interesting, is what impact does it have? It has two really devastating impacts. The first one is that the sales meetings we're having, and meetings are harder to get, they're often shorter in a virtual world, we may talk about that later. They're incredibly valuable and you just do not want to waste them. Well, the problem is just too much sales messaging is not compelling. Customer leaves the meeting, they're sort of a bit, confused by what they've seen. They possibly switched off if you really did try to cover 50 slides. And they're certainly not very interested if you talked about yourself the whole time. So first meetings are not very compelling, and deals we should be winning, or at least getting the next conversation, we're not. And you tend to think, well, that has to be the most important consequence, right? What could be more important than that? In fact, arguably, there is a more important problem even than the first meeting not being compelling, and that might surprise you. and I think this is one of the most important things we might talk about today. The typical way companies are doing messaging is failing what I will call the retellability test. Now, this is a hugely misunderstood and underappreciated aspect of sales messaging. In fact, I would argue this is the single most important word in communications generally, and absolutely in sales communications. Let me explain that. You imagine, think about how sales works. This is you, and you're having, a one-on-one customer conversation, maybe an early stage conversation, pitching your solution. Is that conversation important? Yes. Is that the most important conversation? No, not at all. That's not the most important meeting. Let's imagine this is you. So this is you, Sarah. I'm pitching something to you. Sometime later, there's another meeting. And you're in that meeting, but I'm not. I don't get to be invited to that meeting. And here is the legendary and sometimes shadowy buying group of the customer. And even if you were persuaded in this first meeting, it now becomes your job to retell the story. And the problem with messaging done this way, it utterly and totally fails any kind of retellability test. It's too dense, it's too many slides, often slides that the salesperson didn't even cover. Well, you're not going to fire this up and defend a slide you never even had presented to you. You couldn't possibly learn this in that space of time. And by the way, there's an interesting and odd phenomenon here, which is people do not represent someone else's slide deck. They just don't. I don't have time to get into that. But you really want to avoid PowerPoint for that reason alone. We know from recent research just published that, in fact, these buying groups, well, they're growing, which is interesting, but they spend something like 83% of their time meeting among themselves, not meeting with salespeople. Only 17% of their time is spent with salespeople. So the more these groups become more internally focused, the more vital retellability becomes. And this is what people don't understand about messaging. This has 2 or 3 enormously important implications. One is, if you know your messaging is kind of weak here in the first meeting, you have to assume it is failing catastrophically here. Why? Because what most salespeople do is they either quickly throw the deck together, or the deck's given to them by marketing or sales enablement, and it's not very good. So good salespeople can kind of navigate around it, avoid the garbage slides, kind of explain what wasn't being properly explained here. But in the second meeting, you don't have that luxury. So what you know is, if it's not as good as you want it to be here, it's probably disastrous here. The second implication of this is that I think this changes the standard for messaging. Is our goal to have a successful first meeting? Yes, of course it is. Is that the real goal? No. The real goal of sales messaging is what we would call second meeting success. In other words, that the messaging is so crisp and so clean and so compelling and so engaging that you are both motivated and fully able to take it into that second meeting. But that's not the standard we set. We don't set the standard of second meeting success. We barely set the standard of first meeting success, to be honest. If you talk to companies, almost all of them know their messaging isn't very good and could be better. But when you start talking about retellability, they get really uncomfortable because nobody hits this standard. When we work with a client to build messaging, of course, we're interested in first meeting success, but this is what we're really interested in, messaging that can hit that standard. And then the third implication of this, I think, is incredibly interesting, is what does that mean for the role of messaging? What should you be trying to accomplish? Well, is it the role of a sales message to persuade? Trick question. Yes, of course it is. I am interested here, if this is you, in persuading you, getting you to believe that this is a good solution to pursue. But is that the only goal of a sales message? No, the second goal or purpose of a sales message must equally be to equip. It's not good enough for me to persuade you. I have to equip you to take this message into that subsequent meeting. I mean, oftentimes this individual is excited, they want to advocate, but you're not giving them a chance. There's no way they can walk in with this and hope to do that. So this matters because if you ask 1,000 sales organizations, do you build sales messaging to persuade? They'll say yes. But if you ask them, do you build sales messaging to equip? They won't just say no, they'll say I never even thought about that. So this is, I think, a really interesting story. We make these fundamental mistakes here. We're not bad people or stupid. We just follow the herd, right? We build decks, lots and lots of slides. The more the merrier slides. We don't deconfuse them. We don't decomplexify them. We talk too much about ourselves. And then lo and behold, we create these downstream impacts and we lose deals we really should be winning. And we know this is true because when we fix messaging, conversion rates typically are completely transformed. So I think that's a long answer to a short question. This is primarily what people are getting wrong right now, and this is the impact that it's having.
Very interesting. And how do you think that this has shifted, or how have people been forced to adapt now in a virtual first environment?
That's another incredibly interesting question. The fundamental issue here is that the virtual world, and this I think people are starting to understand, is radically amplifying the impact of these mistakes. Let me say that again. When you're selling in a virtual world, that virtual arena is radically amplifying these mistakes. Let me explain that. It's interesting. When the world went virtual, everybody thought that the fundamental issue was just, oh, I need my sales guys to master the platform. How do I share my screen? How do I mute myself? How do I make sure the cat doesn't jump on me? Now, is that important? You know, yeah, sort of. Do we have the witness protection slide? I mean, this is a slide here of a meeting. You got that there? Can you see that slide of a meeting I did recently? And this is a classic example of a guy being backlit. Now, in this case, I'm the seller, he's the customer, so it doesn't really matter, but that's an awful look. And I still see too many people being backlit, camera in the wrong place, not properly prepared, just all kinds of platform mistakes. So that is an issue, but honestly, that's 5% of the issue. What's really interesting is that selling is a fundamentally social process. And what's happened in the virtual environment is it's moved into a sort of an asocial environment. Now that is a radical thought. Selling is incredibly interesting, almost unique among the professions. It's this very delicate dance between buyer and seller. There's sort of move and counter move. Imagine you're my buyer, Sarah. You may want what I'm selling, but you're still going to be fairly cagey about what information you give. You don't want to give too many positive signals because I'm just going to, jack up the price or whatever it is. And so there's this very complex social ballet going on. Well, suddenly this moves into a thoroughly asocial environment. And this is going to mean these mistakes get really more serious. I can just very briefly explain this through the lens of three things. There are three fundamental ways that the dynamics change in the social environment, in the virtual environment. Firstly is the problem of distraction. In a live meeting, customers might occasionally self-distract, but not too much. It would be very rude. In the virtual environment, you can't stop it. If they don't have their video on, they're probably already checking email, checking their phone. Now, I want you to see the hyperlinks here. If your messaging is already too complex and confusing and unclear, how can that possibly work now if people are mentally distracting, you drift away for 10 seconds to come back, you've missed something, and now you're just fractured, these cognitive fractures happening everywhere. And so people's inability to understand what you're saying, which was already present here, is significantly amplified here. The second thing is very interesting is, by the way, on this point, sellers should always press their buyers to be on camera, turn cameras on. And this is another reason why you do not want to project slides, because if you project slides, rather than just this face-to-face connection, you can show the occasional slide, like I did a minute ago with the darkened image. But you want a rule that you want something other than you on screen no more than 1/3 of the time, because you have got to create this face-to-face connection, particularly to try and manage the distraction. The second one that's interesting is you actually get a known loss of mental bandwidth. Let me just abbreviate that. We all know this. It's called Zoom fatigue. But science is already quite clear here that the focus, the intensity of focus that people have to put into virtual meetings, kind of focus on the screen and somehow tune out everything else, is exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting mentally You've all been there. You sit through a live 3-hour budget meeting, you'd be fine. You sit through a 3-hour budget meeting online and you're ready to just, your head's ready to explode. Now, again, if you have a reduced mental bandwidth, your customer cannot absorb as much. Again, well, what happens if you're packing too much in already? I mean, this was already unrealistic for a live meeting. It becomes horribly unrealistic for a virtual meeting. And the same if your messaging is confusing. So our tendency to blow our customers' mental circuitry, which is already happening, is so much more likely and more serious. The third one, not necessarily the most important, they're all important, but the most interesting to me goes back to what I said earlier, that selling is a fundamentally social process. One of the most interesting things that it's a way in which virtual has impacted sales more than any other profession is you get a loss of feedback or social cues. As I said, selling is great salespeople are not always great communicators. Actually, some of the best salespeople are average communicators, but great salespeople always have very high social IQ. They're very good at reading a room. I can see your face roughly on a monitor here. If you were deeply skeptical, I might pick up on that. Like, Sarah, you look a little skeptical there. What's the deal? And they're very good at reading positive or negative signals. They're also then very good at leaning into them. And what happens then is the momentum of the sale is continued, where what happens in a virtual environment, particularly if you project a load of slides and videos are on, you can't see anything, you lose all those social cues. And a word I like to use is the sale can get sort of becalmed. It can just sort of, the customer goes very passive and very inert. You're not able to read and respond. This is such an essential element of selling. It's almost unique to selling. There are very few other professions where this delicate social interaction is so important. So virtual selling exists here at the confluence of these three very significant social changes. And what they do, as I said, is they are going to amplify these mistakes. So the kind of things we were already teaching companies to do, A, become more important in a virtual environment, even more important than they were in a live environment. And then B, there are certain actual differences. There's things you have to do differently in a virtual environment anyway. For example, you have to plan and design interactivity in a way you never did for a live sales meeting. Live sales meeting, conversation is going to happen. Virtual, it's not. So there are very important, quite well-defined rules that we've developed for how and when you design interactivity, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. So super interesting season. And by the way, one thing we know is we're not going back to the old world. Industry after industry after industry is reporting that most of their buying in the future is going to be virtual. They've fallen in love with the efficiency of it. And it's so much easier for a buyer to be on a 45-minute Zoom call than to sort of entertain some sales team for a whole afternoon plus lunch. So some strategic account selling, we think, will go back to virtual. Big retailers have already announced you're never going to see us again face to face. It's very interesting, I think.
Very interesting. And Tim, your career is this long kind of glamorous one at working for some big companies. How did you kind of land on all the science of this? Where did you pick all this stuff up?
I can't imagine anyone ever describing me as glamorous, but I was compared to Sean Connery recently. But I've always been very deeply rooted in sales, the sales profession, and loved it. But I also have a research background. And I mean, about 15, 20 years ago, I started thinking really hard about why does communication work when it works? And more importantly, why does it fail when it fails? And what I think I discovered that was interesting was that the fundamental key to communication success or failure is the human brain. The human brain is wired to consume information in a certain way. And when you align with that, you'll be very successful. And when you misalign with that, you'll fail. You go to a party and you're introduced to someone and you immediately forget their name. That's very strange, right? Because human memory is phenomenal. How is that working? And it's all to do with the fact that that piece of information, like, hi, I'm Ted, has no context. And the human brain needs context to remember things. And what I learned is there are about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rules, really, of how the brain likes its information, consumes its information, retains and stores its information. And so I developed a model, which then became the company, of teaching companies how to build messaging that conforms to these brain rules. For example, even if your messaging is compelling, it's of no use in sales if it isn't properly remembered and then can be retrieved, because it has to be remembered and retrieved to be retold. So in order to build messaging that has any chance of hitting a retellability standard, you would have to understand some principles of how we lay down memory and then how we're able to retrieve and retell a story later. So there's sort of this underlying premise of brain science here that we talk about more or less depending on context. What sales guys are interested in, they're not interested in the science. They're interested in how do I improve my sales conversion rate and decrease my sales cycle time. And we can get them there without teaching them any science, or they can take all the science in the world if they want that.
Got it. Well, we've got this really interesting framework now that kind of lies underneath probably most of our listeners right now. Their messaging sits perfectly on top of this, and they're realizing a lot of things as we're going through this. So how can our listeners today go back to their desks? Or, I mean, they're probably, as we just said, they're probably in front of the same desk day in and day out, same screen. So how do they switch screens after listening to this episode, and how do they actually build messaging the right way?
So that's obviously a question that suggests a very deep answer, but I can give you, I think you can think of this answer at two levels. There are, as we saw here, there are 3 hallmarks of getting messaging wrong. And what you would want to do is shift mentally at some level to understand what are the hallmarks of getting messaging right and to pursue those. And that's a very high level. Now, to understand the tools by which to do all that would need a deeper treatment, but that's what our e-learning training and other things are there for. But let me walk you through them. There are basically 7 hallmarks of getting a sales message right. This is some messaging we built with Cisco not too long ago for the WebEx platform. Very cool. And this is a perfect example of what getting it right would look like. So what are the 7 hallmarks? I'm going to eventually paint myself into a corner here, but number 1, you want it to be really crisp and clean and simple. You're actually going to have to set aside your tendency to tell too much story, to pack too much in. Any story can be told in the time you have available. This was a sort of 50, 60 slide run. It can be boiled to 4 panels. Simplicity in messaging is a pure question of self-discipline. Now, do you need an appendix? Yeah, maybe. Might you have some supplementary documents for all those crap, all that other details you might need? Yes, but do not contaminate the core message. So really, really crisp and clean and simple. If you don't keep your message within the bandwidth of the brain of the customer, you lose. It doesn't matter how much you want to tell more story. It can be told simply. You have to do that. The second hallmark is really interesting. The message must be deeply rooted in a customer problem. Remember, we're talking here about sender orientation and how likely that is to switch people off. Customers are not interested in talking about you until you've talked about them, until you have shared agreement that there's some business problem that they need to solve. It's not negative, it's not FUD, it's not fear, uncertainty, doubt, you're not blaming anyone. You're just getting together with them to talk about a problem. So let's look at this message, which is about WebEx, which is all about people collaborating. You see this so beautifully captured in the line on the front page here, the line on the first page here. It says this. It doesn't say, hey, WebEx 4.0, really cool. It doesn't say that at all. It says this. With so many tools to communicate, why do your global teams still feel so disconnected? See, a CIO of a large bank is not interested in talking about WebEx, but they're very interested in talking about the fact that their people do not collaborate well enough. The second thing to know about the problem treatment is don't just name it and then jump to the solution. Spend some time unpacking it, talking about why the problem is serious, how it's affecting them in ways they do and perhaps even don't understand. We use the term lead and linger. We have a working rule again that you want at least a third of the sales conversation to be about the problem. Because if they're not interested in the problem or you don't gain agreement on the problem, they cannot be interested in the solution. No one's going to undertake some project or purchase if there's no benefit to them. And so that benefit, that solution, right, has to be anchored in a problem. But this is unbelievably rare. Almost all of these decks, primarily because they're sender-oriented, there's almost no reference to a customer business problem. If there is, it's scanty, it's just very brief, and it's usually like slide 23, by which time it's far too late. The third hallmark of great messaging, this is very interesting, but I don't have time really to unpack it, is your entire argument, and particularly your value proposition, should be expressed through the lens of a small number of ideas. And this is because that's the way the brain stores information. Your brain does not store fact and data in the way a hard drive stores fact and data. If you take this podcast, if someone watched this and then later a friend said to them, oh, what was that about? They're not going to kind of click a recording and play a recording from their brain. They don't have that. What they're going to say is, oh, it's kind of interesting. This guy was talking about retellability, the importance of your sales message performing when you're not there to wrangle it, in that second meeting. And he talked about the challenge of virtual being the movement or migration of selling into an environment with different social dynamics. You see, that's what people do. What they do is they boil information to its essence, to its ideas. That's in fact how we store information. And great communicators understand this. And so they feed the brain of the audience exactly what it's looking for, which is big ideas. If you look at this message, you can't read them here, but it's actually very clear, these big green bars. These are the big ideas. This is what this pitch is about, 3 or 4 big ideas. One of the ways to think, by the way, this is insights. I mean, Challenger selling model. I did the original Challenger research when I ran the sales program at Corporate Executive Board. And it was all about insight, but the question that was raised by Challenger was, well, what is an insight? Where does it come from? A good way of thinking about this is simply this: belief. What do you want your customer to believe, or what would they need to believe in order to take the action you want them to take? There's a message here for a lighting solution for a hospital. And a big part of the pitch is one idea that says, implementing this solution is non-disruptive. Now, why is that important? Because this thing could solve so many problems and be so cost-effective, but I can't buy it if I'd have to shut the hospital for a month and put a load of old people out in the parking lot. So what you do is you think about what would your customer need to believe, and you build your ideas back from that. So they would need to believe that this solution is non-disruptive, that it's easy to deploy. So insights are, we can talk a lot about this. Insight-based selling is a good thing, but the question you need to know, our answer is, where do they come from? And that was never really answered by the insight selling, the purveyors of insight selling. What we would argue is based on the establishment of beliefs. Number 4, can we tee up Toyota? Number 4, your ideas need to be powerfully supported. And particularly supported, I'm running out of space, in a way that's going to be highly memorable. Now, why is that so important? It's because we tend to support our arguments only with fact and data. And so we lay out an argument, a big idea, and then we support it with fact and data, and that's okay, but it's not very memorable, and that hurts you. So a good example, imagine I was trying to sell you a Toyota truck or a truck of any kind, and I tried to convey to you that it can tow a lot of stuff. That's my big idea. It can tow a lot of stuff. I could give that to you using fact and data, 10,000 foot-pounds of torque or something like that, but it wouldn't be very memorable. Or I could show you this. And that is actually an image Toyota did use. Now, the funny thing is, a lot of people remember this, and that's noteworthy because that ad hasn't appeared for well over a decade, of the Tundra towing a space shuttle. Now, how heavy is a space shuttle? I don't know, but it's a hell of a lot heavier than my bass boat, I'm prepared to bet. So what you want to do is, through imagery, story, metaphor, or physical artifact, those are the 4 tools, you can, those are the 4 ways of supporting or illustrating an argument that's very brain resonant. So it's what we call right brain engagement. So you develop great ideas, and then you develop the proof of those ideas in ways that are very powerful and memorable, and therefore retellable. The 5th and 6th, I'll just be very quick here. The 5th is you've got to develop this in a logical story or flow. I didn't explain this earlier, but one of the reasons most messaging is confusing is there's no narrative story in it. It's just slide after slide after slide. It's what we call a topic-driven narrative. But the good news is every sales conversation has within it an inherent narrative, and every sales message is a symphony of three movements. Movement one is you, the customer, have a problem, and it's bigger and possibly even more serious than you thought it was. That now gets you very interested in movement two, which is we have a solution which will completely solve this problem and is fundamentally superior to our competitors. It's movement two, leading you to the third movement, which you're now very interested in, is, well, so this is how we would move forward together. And at an uber level, every sales message has that narrative arc, and that is going to be huge for both comprehension, but also for retellability. So you want to organize your material typically better than you are doing. The sixth is really simple. It's just make sure that you have a clear and well-defined next step. It is possible to have a great meeting, but it's vague and unclear where we go next, where you want to land the plane. If the customer's excited about this, give them a concrete next step. It's kind of sales 101. The seventh one is really interesting, though. I'm literally painting myself into a corner here. The seventh one is really interesting, and this is one that most people don't think about. What you need to do is embed your message in a document that is specifically designed for retellability. In other words, I build a document knowing that you, Sarah, are going to present this to the management team later. So it has quite a lot of text on it. It's not a marketing document because it has to support the conversation. Everything that's on here is something you don't have to remember. It's beautifully and logically laid out. To some extent, it's elegant and pretty, but it really doesn't need to be at all. But you build a document for retellability. And the reason that's so important is that is the polar opposite of what we do. We build documents that are guaranteed not to be retold. And what we have to do is take this construct for the intellectual structure of an argument and bake it into a really interesting document. In other contexts, the presentation I'm giving today would be supported by a handout. And we know that people can take that handout, and even though this is a fairly complex 1-hour keynote, when we do a keynote, they're fully able to represent the argument internally because we built a handout to support it. So that's the base, that's a very high level. As I said, we've got some training and stuff that goes deep on how to do this. There are tools that support all of this. But one thing we know is when you build messaging this way, you see a dramatic improvement in those two sales outcomes. We commonly see messaging move from a 20-30% sales conversion rate to a 50-60-70% sales conversion rate. That's not unusual. This was a documented case, 13% sales conversion rate when it was, I have it here. This was the old PowerPoint. This was the old PowerPoint deck, not the worst I've ever seen, about 40 slides. That became this sales conversion rate, 13% to 34%. And cycle time halved because the conversion rate goes up because it's more compelling, because it's problem-centric, and the cycle time goes down because it's so retellable. It's very easy for the customer to spread the news internally. So we see those results. And if we have 30 seconds, I'll show you something really funny. A couple of years ago, we had a client who challenged us on this and said, well, does it really work on the brain in a different way? So I'll show you 3 pictures. So what we did is we got a load of sales guys in a room, and Bryce, let's put the first one up there. We wired them to a bunch of brain scanners working with a cognitive neuroscientist out of Stanford to measure the brain activity and what was happening in the brain depending on the type of presentation. And what I'll do is I'll just show you a couple of slides on this. When presented with the same sales message using the more traditional approach, so a lot of PowerPoint slides, this is brains, actually it's an eye scan of where their focus and attention went. And what we learned is it didn't go anywhere. That slide's very pretty with the bullets arranged in a circle, but it's a bulleted PowerPoint slide. And we learned 2 things from this. One is the customer just couldn't find anywhere to focus. They were looking for what? A unifying idea and not finding one. So they're kind of dotting around. And then the funniest thing is the dark shade is where their greatest attention went. Do you see that red, oh, thank you, Bryce. You see that red dot there? That's where their deep attention went. Do you know what's behind that? Nothing. It's white space. So very typically, the science proved that when you build a message, however pretty the slide, if it has no logic or sequence or structure or governing idea, the customer kind of desperately looking for somewhere to focus, and then eventually they just kind of switch off. Now, in contrast, look at the same technology using when the message was redesigned using our models. This is primarily about having a properly architected message, but also embedded in a great document. And again, you see two things. Number one, I wish you could see this as it appeared using time series. The customer, when they open the document up, they kind of scanned it briefly, just kind of mentally get a picture of it. But then what they did is they tracked literally block by block, item by item with the seller. So they were tracking beautifully with the argument, problem on the left, solution on the right. And so that is an object lesson in the customer learning something. They're learning the message, which obviously means they're going to be able to retell it. And the second thing, again, look at that dark shade on the left. That was the middle of the problem discussion. And that was kind of the big and most painful piece of the problem of getting this piece of technology wrong. This is a technology company. And so you just see the second thing you see here is just that tremendous engagement and boost that you get when you lead with the customer problem. And so that kind of validates very much from a scientific standpoint some of these empirical results. The other thing, I'll just throw up one last slide. The other thing that's very interesting is at the end of the experiment, so we had different groups, right? Some groups were presented to the old way, very well presented, but the message itself wasn't well constructed. Some presented our way, the new way. And what we did is we administered at the end of the experiment, immediately afterwards, a very, very simple multiple choice test to test basic comprehension. And trust me, these were not hard questions. I mean, these were very simple questions of what have you just had presented. And Bryce, if you can bring that up, the group presented to, using the traditional model, made in aggregate 10 errors. So it was two groups of about 10 people, and between them, they made 10 factual errors. The group presented to the new way made between them only one error. Now, I'm not going to claim this is fully statistically significant, but it is absolutely directionally correct to say that you're getting about a 10 times higher error rate or comprehension failure, or you could argue comprehension is 10 times better. It's not quite true to say that when presented to using this model. So I think what we've done is interesting today, or I hope it's interesting. This is what we're getting wrong in a pre-COVID world, and this is why our outcomes are hurting. The virtual world is going to amplify this, not because we can't figure out the platform, but because we're having trouble bringing the social dynamic into the virtual world. This is how you solve it. You could literally get up tomorrow and build a message and say, can I get it to conform to these 7 hallmarks? I will say a bit more training would always be helpful because there are tools that underlie these principles. If you do this, you see a measured improvement in sales outcomes. All our clients see this. And we kind of played around with understanding why, because we actually can see some of the underlying way that the properly built messaging works more effectively with the brain. So that's our story today, and I'm sort of out of space. So I don't know if you have any other questions. I can't write anything else maybe in there.
No, that's perfect. How fascinating. Yeah. So interesting to cover what's going wrong, how to get it right, and all the other elements that come into play here. And speaking of that training piece, if people do want to learn more from you, Tim, if they want to learn more about Oratium, where can they do that?
So my email, anyone can email me, is very simple. It's tim@oratium.com. Oratium. Oratium is the company. You can go to our website. We just actually launched a new website, which is really nice. I think what people will find interesting is the e-learning we have, mastering the virtual sales conversation. It's a really, really cool resource. A lot of companies now using this to train their whole sales force. People obviously can find me on LinkedIn. But people just shoot me an email, and happy to chat about some of the resources, or they can go find what they're looking for at our website.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Predictable Revenue Podcast. A very interesting and different presentation to have your mirror board there. It's a magical thing, and we won't try to get into how it possibly could work, but really incredible to have those visuals to go along with it. So thank you so much again, Tim, for joining us.
My pleasure. Just, I really hope people can take this away, do something with it, and see the outcomes they're looking for. So thanks, Sarah. That was fun today.
Thank you. And thank you guys again for joining us on another episode of the Predictable Revenue Podcast. We'll catch you next time.